that always reminded me time was passing and I was just getting heavier, just more expensive to feed, and my aunt, who had taken me in when my mother left for good, was lean. They never said it to my face the first time, not exactly, but I heard it anyway. Felt it in the sideways glances at the dinner table, in the way the plates were portioned out with just a little less for me, in how the good news always skipped past me like a skipped stone, as if joy was a luxury I hadn't earned the right to hold. And I'll never forget the moment it crystallized, the moment the truth of how they saw me slipped out in words so sharp they cut through years of silence. I was 13, standing in the narrow kitchen where the ceiling fan clicked like a ticking clock, the wand over the sink, muttering to her husband about the groceries, about how fast things disappeared, and she didn't know I was there, not until she sighed and said, "It's just another mouth to feed, that's what she is." And her voice wasn't cruel or dramatic, just tired, matter-of-fact, like she was reading off a receipt she hadn't meant to pay, and I stood there frozen, holding the bag of rice I had been sent to fetch like it weighed the full sum of my worth. And something in me just fractured, like I had finally been named by the people who'd always treated me like background noise. And suddenly every cold glance, every sigh when I asked for school supplies, every maybe next time when I wanted new shoes made sense. They didn't see me as family, not really. I was charity, a burden, a mistake they hadn't asked for but one they were too proud to give back. And from that moment on I stopped asking for things, stopped speaking when I wasn't spoken to. I folded myself smaller and smaller each day until I could practically disappear, and they seemed fine with that, maybe even relieved, because invisible mouths don't eat much and they certainly don't dream. And the house I lived in, their small 2-bedroom apartment, on the 3rd floor of a sagging complex with rusted stair rails and a view of nothing but more broken windows, became less of a home and more of a waiting room, like I was just sitting there, day after day, waiting for the next reminder that I didn't belong, and they gave them to me often. In the way my cousins got new backpacks every school year while mine was duct taped together from 5th grade through high school. In the way the TV would be turned off the second I walked into the room, as if even watching what they watched was a privilege I hadn't earned. In how I was never part of the stories told at dinner, how no one remembered my birthday until the day had already passed and then said, "Oh, we meant to get you something," like an afterthought, like I was something to be apologized for only when it became too obvious to ignore. And the thing about being treated like an extra mouth to feed is that eventually, you start believing that's all you are, and I wore that label like a second skin, kept my head down at school, didn't bother trying out for sports or theater or clubs because how could I ask for rides or uniforms or even their time when I knew what they thought I was costing them just by existing. And so I existed quietly, working part-time jobs as soon as I was old enough, handing over most of the money for rent, even though no one else my age seemed to be paying to live with family. But I did without question because I didn't want to give them more reasons to resent me, and I kept my dreams tucked away like contraband, whispered thoughts of escape and ambition I never dared speak aloud, because wanting more when you're already a burden feels selfish, feels like sin. And it wasn't until I was 17, sitting in the public library on a rainy afternoon, that something shifted. There was a brochure left behind on a table, a community college program for students from low-income families, and I remember staring at it for hours, reading it over and over like it was written just for me. And that was the day I decided that I wouldn't stay their extra mouth forever, that I would find a way out, not just to escape the weight of their disdain, but to build something they could never take from me. And from that moment forward, everything I did was with that goal in mind. I took every overtime shift, studied during my breaks, applied for scholarships in secret, filled out FAFSA forms on the library computers, and never once breathed a word of it to them because I knew better than to expect encouragement. And I carried every rejection and every acceptance silently, with a fire they never saw because they never looked. And when I got into the program, when I was offered financial aid that covered most of it, I didn't even celebrate. I just made plans, found roommates, scraped together moving money, and told them the day before I left, I got into college, I'm moving out. And their reactions were exactly what I expected. A shrug from my aunt, a sarcastic "good luck with that" from her husband, and a "don't expect us to help if it doesn't work out," that landed like a slap. But I didn't flinch, I didn't cry. I just nodded, packed my one suitcase, and walked out of that apartment with no goodbye, just a final glance over my shoulder at the place where I had learned how to disappear. And I promised myself as I walked down those cracked steps for the last time, that one day I would never have to walk past that door again unless it was on my terms. And I kept that promise through every late-night shift, every ramen dinner, every lonely Christmas, every exam that nearly broke me, every paycheck that went into savings instead of splurges. I held on to the vision, not just of leaving them behind but of one day owning something they'd never see coming, and I didn't know how or when, but I knew the apartment always smelled like oil and something burnt toast, burnt tempers, burnt out dreams, and I learned early on to keep my shoes lined perfectly by the door, to never leave dishes in the sink, and to walk without sound, like a shadow slipping through a home that didn't want me there but couldn't quite justify pushing me out. And the wallpaper curled at the edges like it was trying to escape too. The carpet wore tracks where footsteps repeated endlessly between the kitchen and the couch in the bathroom, like everyone was going somewhere but never arriving, and I had a corner of a room I shared with a cousin who made it her mission to remind me daily that I was a visitor, not a sibling, not a daughter, not even a permanent fixture, and everything I owned fit into a small suitcase that lived under the twin bed I was told to make perfectly every morning, even though no one ever made theirs, because "you're lucky to have a place here," was repeated like a gospel, a justification, a weapon used to keep me quiet, and I learned not to correct them, not to point out how many nights I heard them complain about how full the fridge was getting or how tight things were with another person eating our food, and I wondered as I scraped peanut butter onto dry toast for the fourth dinner in a row, how many bites of food it would take to be worth something, how many loads of laundry, how many afternoons spent babysitting their kids or vacuuming the stairs without being asked, and still I never belonged, not even in the photos that lined the hallway walls. All smiles and school portraits and framed certificates with my name conspicuously missing. And it wasn't that they hated me, not overtly, it was worse than that. They tolerated me like old furniture that wasn't useful but too heavy to throw out, and everything in that apartment whispered the same message. This is not your home, you are here on borrowed time, behave accordingly. And so I did. I moved around their lives like a ghost, present but never felt, absorbing their routines and resentments, without ever asking for more, and I memorized the sound of their moods. The shuffle of slippers when my uncle was angry, the way drawers slammed harder on days the bills came in, the pitch of my aunt's voice when she was preparing to snap at someone, and I stayed clear of those sounds, maneuvering like prey in a forest, never drawing attention because when I did, it only brought lectures or guilt trips or reminders of the bills they paid and the kindness I apparently owed them everything for. And when I did manage to claim a sliver of space, a book on the coffee table, a drawing pinned to the fridge, it never lasted long, always quietly removed or moved aside as if my existence could never be allowed to take up room. And I remember once getting a B+ on a test I'd studied for during late nights after cleaning the kitchen, and I brought it to my aunt with something like hope in my voice, and she didn't even look up from her show before saying, "Don't expect a reward for doing what you're supposed to." And that's when I stopped trying to impress them, because you can't win love from people who've already decided you don't deserve it, and I stopped bringing things home, stopped sharing news, stopped laughing too loudly, and slowly I became exactly what they accused me of being: quiet, detached, another mouth to feed and nothing more, because it was safer that way, and the apartment with its flickering lights and paper-thin walls felt less like shelter and more like a test. I was constantly failing, a place that reminded me daily that I was unwanted but still responsible for gratitude, like I should be thanking them for every cold shoulder, every silent meal, every birthday that came and went without a candle or a card, and I used to lie awake listening to the sounds of their lives happening without me. The laughter in the living room, the clinking of forks during dinner, the television blaring during family movie nights I was never invited to, and I'd close my eyes and imagine a room with a door that locked from the inside, a space that smelled like lavender or nothing at all, a place where I could cry without worrying someone would mock me for it, where I could eat without counting how many slices of bread I took, where I could rest without guilt. And I promised myself that one day I'd have that room, not just for the sake of peace, but because I wanted to know what it felt like to exist in a space that welcomed me, that didn't need me to shrink or perform or apologize for breathing. And until then, I learned to live in small victories: the one corner of the balcony that caught sunlight in the mornings, the library card I paid for myself, the notebooks I kept hidden under my mattress where I wrote down every insult I'd ever heard, every slight I could never speak out loud, and I filled those pages not with revenge fantasies but with escape routes, maps made of dreams and deadlines, and I promised myself I'd never forget the feeling of being in that home that wasn't mine, not because I wanted to hold on to the pain, but because I wanted to remember how it shaped me, how it forged in me a kind of determination they never saw coming. And when I finally walked away from that place, I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't haunted by it, but because I knew that looking back might undo me, might remind me how close I'd come to believing them, and I refused to carry their version of me into the future I was building brick by brutal brick, alone but no longer invisible. Scraps became a way of life, not just in food but in everything that made up daily existence, as though the universe, or at least the apartment I was forced to call home, had decided that my portion of life would be the leftovers, the hand-me-downs, the never-quite-enoughs, and I learned not to flinch when my plate had less, not to ask why my clothes were always someone else's rejects, not to question why my birthday gifts came weeks late or not at all. Because asking for anything in that place always ended in guilt, in sighs and glances exchanged over my head like I wasn't standing there, in lectures about how hard they worked and how lucky I was not to be on the street like other kids. And I wanted so badly to believe them, to convince myself that silence was a fair trade for shelter, that the absence of kindness could be justified by a roof and a mattress, even if that mattress had springs that left bruises on my back and was wedged in the corner of a room I wasn't allowed to decorate, and the silence, though heavier than the scraps, was something I began to wear like armor, because speaking up never helped, it only made things worse, and eventually you stop asking why they didn't ask about your day, why they rolled their eyes when you entered a room, why every small request was met with exaggerated irritation, and you start telling yourself that maybe you are too much, maybe you should have been better, quieter, more grateful, and it becomes this twisted loop in your head. If I stay quiet, maybe they'll like me more. If I clean more, maybe they'll stop complaining. If I disappear just enough, maybe they'll stop looking at me like a bill they forgot to pay. And when I got my first job at a diner 3 blocks from school, the same job no one offered to drive me to or ask how it went, I brought home half my paycheck and laid it on the kitchen counter with a kind of pride I didn't feel anywhere else. But even that became a new reason for resentment, because suddenly I wasn't just an extra mouth, I was a paycheck too, and still no one said thank you, not once, not when I bought groceries or covered the electric bill when they fell behind, not when I paid for my own school supplies or took the younger kids to school to give my aunt a break. And I told myself over and over again that this was just what families did, that maybe they were tired or distracted or just not good with words, but deep down I knew, families don't treat you like an afterthought when you show up every single day. Families don't forget you on purpose. And so I stopped waiting for recognition and instead started focusing on surviving, on building something in the background of my life that no one could take. And my journals filled with schedules and goals and job applications and quotes I copied from library books. Anything to remind myself that this wasn't permanent, that the scraps weren't all there was. But still, every night when the lights were off and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards, I'd lie in my little bed and replay the day, trying to find one moment where someone saw me, heard me, smiled at me without calculation. And most nights I came up empty, and the loneliness became so thick it felt like a second skin, pressing in around my ribs until it hurt to breathe, and I knew I couldn't keep living like that, not forever. Not without becoming someone I wouldn't recognize, someone angry or bitter or so numb they forgot how to feel. And that fear, the fear of becoming like them, fueled me more than anything else, pushed me to keep saving, keep studying, keep holding on to the tiniest thread of hope that there was something better waiting for me, something more than silence and shame. And even on the worst days, when I felt invisible to the people who should have loved me most, I promised myself that I wouldn't let this define me, that I wouldn't let the scraps of affection and crumbs of approval be the only kind of love I ever knew. And so I stayed silent on the outside, but inside I was building a voice, one strong enough to one day say no, to walk away, to take back everything they'd tried to shrink in me. And I swore I would never again let anyone make me feel like I was less than enough. It didn't happen all at once. This idea of leaving, not the physical part but the mental separation, the slow undoing of the rope that had tethered me to a place that never felt like home. And for the longest time, even as I endured the coldness, the eye rolls, the pointed reminders that I was lucky to be here, I hadn't really believed I could escape it. Because when you grow up feeling like a charity case, like your existence is a debt someone else regrets paying, you start to internalize that your dreams are indulgences, that your ambition is arrogance. And it wasn't until I started working extra shifts at the diner, picking up every early morning and every late clothes they would give me, sweating through polyester uniforms and aching feet, counting change with trembling hands because every dollar mattered, that I began to see a way out, a light not at the end of the tunnel but something I'd have to build with my own hands, brick by invisible brick. And I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me, stopped hoping they'd change, stopped wasting energy trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. And instead I quietly started planning, saving in a hidden envelope duct-taped beneath the bottom drawer of my dresser, one $5 bill at a time, every tip I didn't spend on bus fare or basic hygiene tucked away with the kind of discipline that made me seem boring to anyone my age. But I didn't care because I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to survive, to outlast the apartment walls that seemed to whisper at night that I'd always be stuck there, always be the one cleaning up after everyone else, always be the one told I was just this or only that. And so I began to build a life in secret, applying for scholarships during my lunch breaks, asking quiet questions at school about community college options, signing up for library seminars about resume writing and career pathways, anything that pointed me toward a future I could call mine. And I told no one, not my aunt, not my cousins, not even the one classmate who sometimes let me copy their notes, because I had learned the hard way that sharing my plans only invited sabotage or skepticism, and I needed neither, not now, not when I had finally begun to believe that I was capable of more than just taking up space. And I made lists, long, detailed, color-coded lists, about what I'd need to leave. First month's rent, deposit, food budget, emergency fund, and I researched neighborhoods and bus lines and the cheapest laundromats, and I made calls from payphones so no one would overhear me. And I carried every step of that plan like a precious secret, something too fragile to expose, and still I gave them what they asked for. I scrubbed their dishes, picked up their dry cleaning, watched their kids, handed over part of every paycheck. But my mind was already gone, already living in a place where I could hang up pictures without asking, where no one would sigh when I walked into a room. And when the day finally came, when I had just enough saved, just enough leverage to secure a tiny basement unit with peeling linoleum and a drafty window, I didn't tell them until I was already packed, and even then my aunt barely looked up from folding laundry, just muttered something about how I'd be back once it got hard. And I nodded without emotion, because I knew she didn't understand what it had taken to get here, what kind of strength it required to walk out that door knowing no one would chase me. And I carried my suitcase down those same stairs I had climbed for years with bags of groceries and loads of disappointment, and I didn't cry, not even when I stood alone in my new space surrounded by the unfamiliar, because it was mine. And that meant more than comfort, more than approval, more than anything they had ever withheld. And that night, I laid on the floor with a rolled-up hoodie as a pillow, and I let myself feel what I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not rage, but relief. And I promised myself I would never go back, not in desperation, not in guilt, not even in longing, because my exit strategy hadn't just been about leaving. It had been about finally stepping into the life they told me I didn't deserve. And I would do whatever it took to make sure I never had to beg for space at someone else's table again. It came folded inside a plain envelope. No gold seal, no dramatic stamp, just legal text printed in sharp black ink that didn't seem nearly heavy enough to carry the weight of what it meant. But as I ran my fingers over the top line, title deed, ownership transfer, I felt something shift deep inside me, something slow and seismic, like I was no longer tethered to the past in the same suffocating way, but had instead lapped it, outgrown it. And for a long moment I just stared at it, not quite believing it was real, that after everything, the scraps, the silence, the shame of being treated like charity, I now held proof that the very building they used to weaponize against me was now mine. And not just figuratively, not just in fantasy, but in the binding legal sense, in the way that required signatures and contracts and quiet partnerships and months of back-and-forth emails and late-night phone calls I took in stairwells so no one would hear, because revenge wasn't the goal. It never had been. What I wanted was closure, something permanent that said, "You were wrong about me," and nothing said that louder than owning the place they still called home. And it wasn't easy getting there. It took years of saving, investing, learning, failing, regrouping, pushing through nights where the numbers didn't add up and the self-doubt crept in. But I never gave up, because I remembered every cold meal, every eye roll, every time I was told I wasn't enough, and I had turned each of those moments into fuel. And when I saw the listing for the building go up, when I recognized the cracked paint in the pictures and the same sagging stairs I had walked down with nothing but a suitcase and a promise to myself, I knew I had to try. And I called the agent and asked questions in a tone that didn't tremble. I negotiated with people who didn't care about my history, only my credit and my commitment, and I signed everything without flinching, because I was ready. Not for revenge, not to rub it in their faces, but because I needed to reclaim the space where I was made to feel invisible, to turn it into something that no longer had power over me. And when the sale closed and the keys were offered, I didn't even smile at first. Just breathed deep, long, and quiet, because the victory wasn't in the transaction, it was in what it represented. Freedom, validation, and a kind of poetic justice that didn't need to shout to be felt. And I walked through the building slowly, floor by floor, letting the memories come but not consume me. And when I reached the apartment where it all began, I didn't knock, I just stood outside the door and listened, not to the people inside, but to the version of myself who had once lived there, who had once counted how many slices of bread were left and wondered if love was always supposed to hurt. And I whispered, "We made it, Not to them but to her, to the girl they tried to erase, and then I turned and walked back down, ready for what came next, because owning the building wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new kind of power, one that came not from anger but from the quiet certainty that I had rewritten the story they once tried to bury me in. The letter wasn't cruel, and that was intentional, because cruelty had been their language, not mine, and I didn't need to mimic the same sharpness they once used to slice through my dignity when I was just a child hoping to be acknowledged. I needed only the truth, set plainly, backed by the law, the kind that didn't scream or beg for attention but simply existed with the weight of finality. And as I drafted it late one night at my small kitchen table, the overhead light flickering against the dull edge of a worn wooden surface, I realized that this wasn't a letter at all. It was closure, typed out in Black Times New Roman, punctuated by legal references, and embedded with everything I had endured in silence. It began with a greeting, formal and free of warmth: "Dear tenants," because to call them family would have been a lie too thick to stomach, and then it unfolded like any notice might, acknowledging their lease, informing them of an increase in rent due to updated market valuations and rising maintenance costs, pointing out their month-to-month agreement, and stating that their new payment would be due the following month, with options to terminate their lease if they chose not to comply. But the part that mattered, the part one typed and retyped until I was sure it carried the full gravity of my voice without any emotional mess, was the line that read, "Please address any correspondence or inquiries to the new property owner, listed below," and beneath it my full name. Clean, deliberate, undeniable, because I didn't need to spell it out for them. I didn't need to attach a letterhead that screamed, "The kid you once pitied now owns your roof." I just needed to exist in ink, in proof, in position, and as I folded the letter into an envelope, my hands didn't shake like I thought they might. They moved with the calm of someone who no longer needed to be heard by the people who spent years pretending she didn't exist, and I walked it to the mailbox that night, the cold air snapping against my cheeks, my coat too thin but my chest warm with the heat of certainty, and I dropped it in without ceremony, without second-guessing, because I wasn't mailing a challenge, I was mailing a fact. And in the days that followed, I imagined their reactions in vivid detail. My aunt opening it with her usual suspicion, expecting maybe a coupon or another overdue bill, and the flicker of confusion when she read my name, the way she'd probably flipped to the second page like there had been a mistake, only to reread the header with dawning horror. I pictured her husband swearing under his breath, pacing the kitchen in the same slippers I used to trip over as a child, spitting words like nerve and ungrateful, because that's how they'd seen me for so long. Ungrateful for food I had to ration, for shelter that came with a cold shoulder and side eyes, and I knew they wouldn't respond, not at first, because silence was their favorite weapon, one I had been trained to fear. But this time their silence wasn't power, it was a delay tactic, a failure to process what the letter meant, and I waited, not nervously but expectantly, watching the calendar as the due date approached, and when it finally came they paid. But not in full, not right away, just part of the new amount with no explanation, no note, no acknowledgement, just a begrudging gesture of compliance that told me everything I needed to know. They knew it was real and they hated it, and I took their payment, deposited it, documented it, because I had learned the hard way that when you grow up voiceless, your best revenge isn't confrontation. It's record-keeping, it's having receipts when they pretend they didn't say what you remember. It's having your name on the title when they tell others you never contributed, and still they didn't reach out, not with calls, not with questions, not even with their usual passive-aggressive digs passed through mutual family friends. And at first that absence stung, not because I missed their approval but because some part of me, some small aching part, had wanted a flicker of recognition, a quiet admittance that I had made it, that I had taken the scraps they left me and built something solid. But no, instead they ignored it, as if by ignoring the letter they could erase the truth, erase me. But I had already lived through that once. Through years of being the child who got the leftover rice, the off-brand shampoo, the last turn in the bathroom, the forgotten birthday, and I knew now that their silence wasn't power, it was fear masquerading as control, and I didn't need their recognition anymore. I had outgrown the hunger for it, and still I printed another copy of the letter and placed it in a folder marked proof, alongside the deed, the transaction records, the bank statements, because these were the new relics of my life, not photos in frames or warm holiday memories, but documentation that I had mattered enough to myself, to the system, to the future, to climb out of what they tried to keep me in. And weeks passed, and then came the notice from another unit in the building, one I had also included in the rent adjustment, An email from a single mother on the third floor who thanked me for the improvements I was making, who asked if the laundry room could be fixed next, who offered to volunteer time for a building cleanup, and I sat with that message longer than I had sat with anything else in months. Rereading it not because it was extraordinary but because it was normal, respectful, human, and it reminded me that the letter I sent wasn't just a message to the people who once hurt me. It was a sign to myself that I had stepped fully into the life I had built, that I was no longer operating in reaction to pain but in pursuit of purpose. And when I finally did pass my aunt in the hallway one afternoon while doing a surprise inspection, because yes, owners could do that now, I nodded, calm and polite, and she froze, keys halfway in the lock, her mouth twitching with something between shock and forced civility, and she muttered, "Didn't expect to see you here." And I just smiled, handed her a copy of the maintenance schedule and said, "I own here now," and walked away before she could respond, because I didn't need to hear what came next. I didn't need to know if she spun the story or swallowed the shame. I had already won, not by their rules but by mine, in my voice, through my letter, and that was enough. That I no longer knocked, not because I was rude or had forgotten the rhythm of respect that had once been beaten into me by years of conditional shelter and silenced gratitude, but because I no longer needed permission to enter a space that was legally, contractually, and irrevocably mine. And the irony was almost too rich. The door I had once hovered outside, heart thudding in my throat because I never knew what version of them would answer, was now a barrier I stepped through without hesitation, key in hand, ownership in my back pocket, not to invade, not to punish, but to inspect, to manage, to operate the property like any responsible owner would, because that's what I was now. Not a stray kid lingering on the edges of someone else's domestic theater, but a landlord, a figure with standing, with power, with the law behind me and not against me for once. And I remember the first time I used my key, standing in the familiar hallway listening to the hum of the old fridge inside, the same fridge I'd once cleaned inside and out for a scolded slice of approval. And as the lock clicked and the door creaked open, I half expected to be met with the glares, the accusations, the same old storm of passive aggression. But there was only stillness, only the stale air of a room that had seen too many years of resentment layered into the drywall. And I walked in without pausing, clipboard in hand, camera ready to document whatever violations or concerns I needed to address. Not because I was looking to punish them, but because this was business now, and business required distance, objectivity, clarity, the kind I had been forced to cultivate after years of emotional neglect that had taught me not to flinch when my name was said with a sigh instead of pride. And I noted the broken cabinet hinges, the cracked tiles in the bathroom, the leaking pipe under the sink that they had apparently been living with in silence, probably assuming no one cared enough to fix it, just like I had once assumed no one cared enough to see me. And I added those notes to the report, knowing I'd schedule repairs, pay for them promptly, and keep the receipts, because professionalism was the final blow they wouldn't see coming. And I didn't speak much during those visits, just nods and clipped explanations, letting the paperwork speak for me. Letting the policies they had never thought to read show them who held the authority now, and I could feel it every time we crossed paths, the way they bristled, the way their eyes flicked toward the floor or darted to each other, unsure how to talk to me now that the dynamic had shifted and I wasn't the hungry child at their kitchen table but the person whose name was on the mortgage. And still they didn't ask questions, didn't acknowledge the shift, because pride is a powerful drug, and denial was the only form of self-preservation they knew. But I didn't need their acknowledgement, didn't need their whispered confessions or tepid apologies, because I had long since stopped craving validation from people who had built their comfort on my silence. And with every visit, every document filed, every update to the building's regulations, I felt more secure in my role, more grounded in the reality that I was no longer begging to be let in. I was walking through doors that once felt impenetrable, keys jingling in my hand like punctuation marks at the end of every forgotten slight. And I began making changes, subtle but firm, installing new mailboxes, upgrading lighting in the hallways, enforcing quiet hours, and when the notices went up, signed with my name and contact information, I could almost hear the low simmer of their disbelief, the quiet way they must have reeled at every bulletin board reminder that they now answered to me. But I didn't flinch, I didn't soften, because this wasn't revenge. It was reclamation, the careful restructuring of a narrative that had long painted me as background. And now I was center frame, not with drama but with presence, and the fact that I no longer knocked was just one of many indicators that the rules had changed, that the door they once guarded like a gate to privilege had become just another frame in a building they no longer controlled. And I walked in with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Not just the property but the self I had fought to build, brick by emotional brick until I could walk through that door without trembling, without shrinking, without asking if I was welcome, because now I was more than welcome. I was in charge, and that truth didn't need to be shouted, it only needed to be lived. Raising the rent wasn't a decision I made lightly, though I'm sure that's what they told themselves. That it was personal, that it was my version of payback served cold and legally binding, but the truth was more boring and more brutal. It was necessary, it was just math, it was what came after years of maintenance, neglect, and underpriced leases that kept the building stuck in the past, and I had to make the numbers work not just for sustainability but for myself, because I hadn't climbed out of survival just to sink under someone else's mismanagement. And so I did what any responsible property owner would do. I assessed fair market value, compared similar units in nearby neighborhoods, consulted with property advisors, and when the figures came back I typed up a new notice, one that stated clearly and without apology that rent would increase by 18% starting the following month. And when I pressed print, my heart didn't leap or lurch or twist the way I'd expected. It just stayed steady, quiet, resolved, because I knew that this was the part where things would finally shift, not just in reality, but in their perception of me. And when the letters were hand-delivered and posted in the common area, I didn't stay to watch the fallout, didn't hover near the mailboxes or press my ear to any doors, because I had already lived enough years trying to read their moods, their judgment, their displeasure, and I didn't owe them that anymore. Instead I waited, and the silence that followed was anything but quiet. It was tense, waiting for the first response, the first angry knock or condescending email. And when it came, it wasn't from my aunt or her husband, it was from my cousin, the one who had once snatched my notebooks from my hands and laughed at my thrift store shoes. And now she was writing with forced politeness, asking for clarification, saying they were caught off guard and unsure how to proceed. And I replied with the same tone I used with all tenants: professional, direct, citing market trends, maintenance costs, timelines, and no, there would be no exceptions, no delays, and yes, they were welcome to move out if the new rent was untenable. And the response I got was silence again, but this time it was full of heat, of resistance, of disbelief that the girl who had once been told she was an extra mouth to feed was now the one setting the terms. And I could picture the dinners where my name was thrown around in frustration, where they accused me of betrayal, where they tried to spin the narrative to make me the villain, and I didn't care, not because I didn't feel anything, God, I felt everything, but because I finally knew the difference between guilt and responsibility, and I wasn't responsible for their comfort anymore, not when they had built it on my absence, my compliance, my quiet willingness to be less. And I watched as the payments came in, late, partial, begrudging, and each one was a message not of submission but of recognition, of reality setting in. And eventually they asked for a meeting, said they wanted to discuss the new terms, and I agreed, met them in the building's basement office I had cleaned and painted myself, with new chairs and a folding table and a single potted plant. And when they walked in, their eyes searched my face like they were looking for a trace of the old version of me, the one who used to say sorry before speaking. And I offered them seats but no softness, and we talked about the building, about the rent, about what I was doing with the money, and I told them the truth. I was reinvesting in the structure, updating the plumbing, reinforcing the windows, repainting units, and no, I wasn't making exceptions, not for them, not for anyone, because fair is fair. And what came next surprised even me. My aunt's husband, red in the face, fists clenched, stood up and stormed out. But she stayed, sat there staring at her hands, quiet for once, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were tired, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time, and she said, "You really did it." And I nodded, not smugly, just truthfully, and she added, "We didn't think you would." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. And I said, "That's why I didn't tell you." And she nodded slowly, like she understood that it hadn't been revenge. It had been protection, self-preservation. And I ended the meeting shortly after, letting them leave with the new lease agreements in hand. And as I watched them walk down the hallway, not as family but as tenants, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief, like something old and heavy had finally been put to rest. Because raising the rent wasn't about making them suffer. It was about raising my own standards, about no longer shrinking just to make others comfortable. And I knew some part of them would always resent me for it, always tell the story as though I had turned on them, but I didn't need their approval anymore because I had finally priced myself out of their narratives. Every corner still whispers, not with voices or ghosts, but with memory, the quiet kind that seeps from the walls and lingers in the dust, that rises up when the sun hits the floor just right, or when the air shifts and carries a scent you forgot you remembered. And as I walked through the apartment again, clipboard in hand, pen poised, acting every bit the role of a landlord doing routine checks, I couldn't help but notice the places where my childhood still lived. Not in furniture or family photos, which had long since been replaced with newer, colder arrangements, but in the grooves in the wooden floor where I used to sit cross-legged doing homework on a plastic tray table, in the small dent in the wall from the time I dropped a ceramic bowl and braced for a punishment that never came, not because they were merciful but because I wasn't worth their energy that day, and in the faded spot on the carpet where I used to lay my clothes for school the night before, hopeful that being prepared might earn me some approval, and I stood in the corner by the kitchen where I once overheard them whispering about me, saying I ate too much, took too much, needed too much, and I remembered how I started skipping dinner after that, pretending I wasn't hungry, lying to my own stomach just to make myself smaller, and it hit me, harder than I expected, that no matter how much I had grown, how much I now owned, these walls remembered who I was when I had nothing, and it wasn't that the apartment itself held power over me anymore, but that it bore witness to a version of myself I had worked so hard to outgrow, and being back here in control, in authority, only highlighted the echoes still trapped in the drywall, the emotional fingerprints I couldn't scrub clean no matter how many repairs or renovations I approved. And I paused in the hallway where I used to stand in the mornings, waiting to use the bathroom, listening to the running water and muffled voices inside, knowing that if I knocked, I'd be met with annoyance or outright dismissal. And now I owned that hallway, that door, that silence, and yet it still made my chest tighten because healing isn't a straight line, and there are some scars that ache even when the wound is long closed. And I found myself opening cabinet doors, checking beneath the sink, not because I expected to find anything wrong, but because I wanted to see if the parts of my life I had buried there were still hiding, and I stared at the chipped paint and the familiar squeak of the hinges, and for a moment I was 16 again, crouched down with a rag and a bottle of dollar store cleaner, scrubbing not because anyone asked me to, but because I thought maybe, just maybe, if the space looked better they might look at me better. And I hated that I could still feel that desperation buried under layers of achievement and distance, but not gone, never gone. And I moved through the apartment slowly, each step a confrontation with a version of myself I had tried to forget. The girl who used to cry quietly into a pillow because the walls were too thin for real sobbing, the girl who taught herself to smile at backhanded compliments because at least they were saying something, the girl who stopped dreaming in color because reality was always gray here. And now the color was back, in the fresh paint, in the new light fixtures I'd had installed, in the flowers outside the front entrance I paid someone to water. But inside, in these corners, the air still carried the weight of who I had been, and I realized then that ownership doesn't erase history, it just gives you the choice of what to do with it. And as I stood by the front door about to leave, I reached out and touched the doorframe, the same spot I used to lean against when I got home from school and wasn't sure if anyone would acknowledge me, and it felt the same, solid and indifferent. And I whispered, not to the apartment but to myself, "You're not her anymore." And it wasn't defiance, it was reassurance, a reminder that while the corners may whisper, I no longer have to listen as if they're telling the truth. The confrontation wasn't planned, but it had been inevitable from the moment the first rent increase notice was taped to their door, from the moment I signed the deed and started walking the halls like a stranger with a clipboard instead of a forgotten shadow. And it came one cold morning when I arrived to check a plumbing complaint in one of the lower units and found my aunt standing outside her door, arms crossed, mouth pressed tight in that way that always meant she'd been stewing, calculating, waiting for a moment to say the thing she'd been rehearsing in silence. And our eyes met like two people seeing each other for the first time, not as landlord and tenant, not even as niece and aunt, but as two sides of a history too heavy to ignore. And she didn't ask how I was, didn't comment on how much I'd changed. She just launched into it like a storm she couldn't hold back anymore, her words sharp and fast and laced with accusation. "You really think this makes you better than? You think owning this place means you're entitled to treat your family like strangers?" And I stood there, clipboard by my side, heart pounding not from fear but from the slow burn of everything I had never said, and I told her calmly, too calmly, that I wasn't treating anyone like strangers, I was treating everyone the same, and that was something she had never managed to do. And the words hit her like a slap, her face tightening as she hissed, "We took you in when no one else would." And I almost laughed, bitter and stunned at the gall of it, and I said, "No, you tolerated me. There's a difference," and I never forgot it. And her expression shifted, something breaking behind her eyes that might have been guilt or maybe just rage, and she said I should be grateful, that not everyone would have opened their home to a child who wasn't theirs. And I snapped, not loudly, not violently, but with a clarity that felt like slicing through years of fog, and told her that gratitude doesn't mean silence, that being taken in doesn't mean being stripped of dignity, that I was never ungrateful, I was just exhausted, and that every smile I forced, every meal I skipped, every errand I ran without thanks wasn't proof of love. It was proof of survival, and her voice rose then high and sharp, accusing me of rewriting history, of forgetting the good times, and I said, I didn't forget, I just stopped pretending they were enough to excuse the bad. And the words landed like stones between us, and for a second we both stood in that silence, breathing hard like two people who had finally stripped all the pretense away. And then she asked the question I'd always feared but somehow longed for. Was it really that bad? And for the first time I didn't soften the truth, didn't offer a diluted version to protect her ego. I looked her straight in the eye and said, yes, it was. And I could see the fight drain out of her, like she wanted to argue, to defend, to minimize, but knew she couldn't, and instead she said, I didn't know. And I said, you didn't want to know. And she flinched, and for a moment she looked smaller, not in stature but in certainty, like maybe she finally saw what she had refused to see all these years. And then she said something that surprised me, softly, barely above a whisper, I thought I was doing enough. And I almost broke then, almost let myself be pulled back into that old hunger for reconciliation, but I didn't, because the truth was she had done something, but it wasn't enough, and I told her as much, gently, not to hurt her but to be honest, because pretending it had been okay would have been another lie, another sacrifice I refused to make, and I said, I'm not here to punish you, I'm just here to do my job. And she nodded slowly, eyes brimming with something I didn't want to name, and she said, so that's it? And I said, that's all it ever was. And I turned to go, heart pounding, not from anger but from release, from the relief of finally speaking the truth without flinching. And as I walked away I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, I felt tired but also lighter, because the confrontation hadn't been about winning. It had been about being heard, and I had heard myself loud and clear. The day they left was quieter than I expected, no shouting, no slammed doors, no passive-aggressive parting shots hurled down the hallway, just the sound of boxes shifting against tile, of worn sneakers dragging across the floor, of silence moving in before I'd even turned the key to their old unit, and I watched from the staircase as they made their final trips, arms laden with trash bags and duct-taped boxes, the kind of move that didn't look planned but more like survival kicking in at the last minute, and I didn't feel what I thought I might feel. No triumph, no surge of satisfaction, just a strange, soft ache in the pit of my chest, like watching a story finally reach its last scene, one I'd waited my whole life to witness, and now that it was here, I could barely stand to look at it, because there was something deeply, bitterly human in watching the people who had once looked through you now pretend you weren't watching them. And my aunt moved like someone older than she was, not just in her joints but in her gaze, in the way she avoided looking up at my window, and her husband never even glanced my way, like I had become the ghost in their story, one they couldn't quite confront, and part of me wondered if they'd even spoken about what had happened, about the confrontation weeks ago that cracked something open but never truly healed it. And I knew they wouldn't call, wouldn't text, wouldn't leave a note, not out of pettiness but because pride is its own kind of prison, and the keys to it are swallowed long before anyone realizes they're locked in. And as the moving truck rumbled to life and pulled away, I stood there longer than I needed to, longer than made sense, trying to feel closure in the exhaust cloud it left behind. And when I finally walked back into the empty unit, the echoes rushed at me like waves. The memory of my younger self scrubbing the linoleum, tiptoeing across creaky boards, folding laundry that wasn't hers, waiting for praise that never came, and the space felt smaller now, stripped of all pretense and power, just a worn-out apartment with faded walls and forgotten crumbs in the corners. And I sat in the middle of the living room floor, no furniture, no noise, and I let the weight of it all settle, the history and the hurt and the hollow victory of it. And I thought about how many nights I'd stared at the ceiling above this room, wondering if I'd ever escape, if I'd ever be more than someone else's obligation. And now I owned the ceiling, the walls, the floor, and yet all I felt was tired, not just in body but in soul, because there's something no one tells you about getting everything you once prayed for. Sometimes the prize feels like ashes in your hands, and I didn't regret anything. I knew I had done what needed to be done, had protected myself, had risen from the very space that tried to make me feel small. But it didn't come with joy, it came with finality, with the sharp, aching awareness that healing isn't a parade, it's a quiet room you sit in alone after everyone else has left, wondering what comes next. And I stayed there for hours, letting the emptiness speak, letting it say goodbye in a language only I could understand. And when I finally stood up, legs stiff, throat thick, I turned the lights off one last time, pulled the door closed behind me, and walked away, not just from a unit or a building, but from the version of myself who had once believed that being loved meant being tolerated, and I stepped into the hallway not as a victor, but as someone who had finally made peace with the silence. I bought my peace not with a single transaction, not the moment the title deed was signed or the rent checks started arriving with my name at the bottom, but in 1,000 tiny decisions that added up to liberation, each one forged in the quiet hours when no one was looking, when I was alone with my thoughts and my aching determination. And it wasn't just about money or property or power. It was about finally putting a period at the end of a sentence I had been forced to live for too long, a sentence full of small humiliations and unspoken hurts and the kind of loneliness that sinks into your bones and teaches you to question whether you even deserve more. And owning that apartment, walking those halls, raising the rent, confronting the people who once made me feel like excess weight on a sinking ship. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. And as I stood at the top of the building one late afternoon, the sky stretched wide and pink above the city, I realized that what I had purchased wasn't just real estate or respect. It was my right to exist fully, freely, without apology, without needing to shrink to fit into someone else's comfort zone. And peace looked nothing like I imagined it would, because it didn't come with fanfare or validation. It came with quiet mornings where I made coffee in my own kitchen without listening for footsteps that might scold me, with bills paid on time by my own hand, with a locked door that meant privacy and not isolation, with books stacked on shelves that I chose and clothes in a closet that no one mocked. And I kept a single photo from those years in a box in my closet, not to torment myself but to remember, to honor the version of me who kept going when it made no sense to. And sometimes when I feel the old doubts whispering, I take that photo out and look into my own younger eyes and say, we made it. Because peace, real peace, is not the absence of memory. It's the ability to live alongside it without letting it define you. And I no longer needed their recognition, their apology, their understanding, because I had built a life that answered every insult with stability, every dismissal with purpose. And I moved through the world differently now, not arrogantly but assuredly, not with a chip on my shoulder but with clarity in my stride. And when people asked why I stayed in that building even after they moved out, even after I could have sold it for profit and walked away, I told them it was because that place, for all its pain, had taught me who I was, what I needed, what I refused to become. And I wasn't afraid of its shadows anymore, because I had lit too many fires inside myself to ever be swallowed by the dark again. And the greatest peace wasn't the silence. It was the ownership, the full circle, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had turned a place of rejection into one of rootedness. And I didn't need to tell that story to everyone, didn't need to make them understand the layers of grief and triumph embedded in every crack in the wall, because I understood, and that was enough. And as I lay in bed at night, the city humming softly outside my window, I no longer braced for footsteps, no longer rehearsed excuses, no longer asked for space. I simply breathed deeply and without fear, because peace, it turned out, was not something I waited for someone else to give me. It was something I bought with persistence, with resilience, with every choice to keep going. And now it belonged to me fully, finally, irrevocably.